Hey guys, I wanted to be able to share some shortened clips from a conversation I was able to have with counselors Stephanie Castle and Paul Ober from Refining Grace Counseling. I hope these clips are helpful, but I also want to encourage you. These shortened YouTube clips might be helpful, and I hope they are, but they can't provide the ongoing help and assistance that you need to deal with serious issues like addiction, anger, anxiety, depression. And so I want to encourage you to head to tpcc.org/care or /counseling. We've put some resources together there, including a list of vetted counselors who we trust to get that ongoing support that you need to deal with issues that are complex like this. So again, head to tpcc.org/care or /counseling, and I hope these clips are helpful to you.
I know so many people that are struggling with anxiety right now, and all the what ifs and the just so many things that you could be fearful of or be anxious about in this season. So, what kind of encouragement can you guys share with someone who's dealing with anxiety right now?
First of all, we need to have a lot of grace for ourselves. We know scripture, talks about that we don't have to be anxious, don't be anxious. But at the same time, I think what they're saying is don't live out in that. Don't let that be a constant place. Continue to seek God's support and support in the general for that feeling. Sometimes we get lost in it and it takes over. It's like this physiological event that happens at times, especially if you're talking about panic, but even anxiety, just very strong anxiety. Sometimes people wake up with it. Sometimes it hits because of some benign trigger that doesn't make sense to us. Sometimes we're in a pandemic and everything seems triggering for anxiety. And so it is a system in our body that's actually created to protect. It's part of that amygdala fight or flight. Anger is fight, and a lot of times anxiety feels like fight or flight. So we're sometimes freeze. And, imagine there may be nothing going on in particular that day that creates a panic attack, and you have one anyway. When I get people in and there isn't something this massive going on, a lot of times what we talk about is, let's look at all the physical possibilities that could be contributing to your anxiety. If there's nothing specific glaring, sometimes it is, hormonal or other physical things at play. I tell people a lot to get a physical and make sure, you've got a good baseline there. And then we can start thinking about, creating some sense of understanding around it. If it's triggered from like trauma or, what's going on circumstantially in your life, that kind of thing, that's a different matter. Then we want to give some ability to manage the system going on physically first. And then we move to thinking, like the overthinking part of anxiety that comes in. But it's really hard to talk to yourself rationally when you're in the middle of shortness of breath, heart rate running, all those things. You have to tend to your physical self and that physiological event first. Then you can move into a more detailed approach where you might journal or do some other things. Sometimes prayer and breathing exercises can be really effective for managing the initial anxiety attack if you're having one.
Mm-hmm. Can we drill down on that a little bit? I know you just shared prayer and breathing exercises. Are there other things, techniques, things that you would suggest when somebody feels that onset of anxiety or panic to
One
kind
of
of
the
help?
things that I have to talk with people about is how our system is set up. Sometimes we hear about a lot of people that use inappropriate ways to cope, like kids sometimes smacking their head against a wall, or teens or adults cutting or doing other things to physically harm. The reason that works is because our brain will always go to the pain first, a pain response, because we're self-preserving or preserving. So instead of doing that, instead of hurting ourselves to try to manage the anxiety, a better way would be something like, sucking on a lemon slice because it's sour, and the brain will register that, and that can bring us down just enough to start some breathing exercises, right? Or I've had people get those hot, they're like gobstoppers that are really, really hot cinnamon, and pop those in their mouth for 10 seconds and then take them out and start breathing exercises. Doing some things that are safe for us. The yeses, again, having your list of yeses for coping can be really helpful, because you can't necessarily reason out of the anxiety until you deal with the panic.
That's good.
And Stephanie, I've heard, like you're saying, if someone's disconnecting or disassociating from the environment at the moment, is it to like take the deep breaths? I've heard like, tell me 5 things you see, tell me 4 things you hear, tell me 3 things you smell. And all that's to ground them in the moment, right? So you can't even do like, well, let's stop and think. I can't stop and think yet. My amygdala is taking over, like all this kind of biochem going on first. So once that's done, I like the other example I encourage people to do is I've heard it said like a scaling question or a temperature gauge, so you're feeling like this is a panic attack. What would you call it? Well, I didn't want to go to school today, or my boss has to have a call meeting. That feels like a 10. Well, you have to go home and talk to your wife. That feels like a 5, or that feels, what I mean? So you get a scaling question to try to help them realize they can't live at the 10. Right. The temperature idea, I've heard it say like, if you're most comfortable at 70 degrees, that's your comfort zone. Well, what makes you hot getting up to the 90s? What makes you feel like you're freezing down to 7? That fight or flight or freeze could be a way to help them, again, take control of their own body regulation and realizing what does it feel like. And sometimes adding the idea of what could be worse or what could be better might change the thinking versus feeling so stuck.
And having some of those things written down for themselves that they can pull out, like, what do you smell? What do you see? What do you hear? So that they can immediately have a trigger from therapy that kind of helps them start that process, can be really helpful. And I've had clients actually use the scaling stuff that Paul's talking about, but put it on a calendar. Like, what numbers have I been today? Maybe I woke up and I felt like an 8, but by the midday I was at 5, and it can help them kind of track and see what's triggering them if they're not sure.
That's really good, Stephanie. A lot of times I do that more with anger or pornography to track patterns to see if there's like, okay, has it happened more on the weekends or in the day or work day or something like that? So you see the patterns and kind of encourage investigate, be an investigator of yourself. We're looking for those patterns. The other thing I was going to add, you talk about a tip. So classic, I talk to guys a lot who don't want to journal, right? I don't want to journal, but if I need to investigate or I want to track down my thoughts, that sounds more, I don't know, productive, not as feeling based, but so I would call it this way, the truth model. The truth is like T, like acronym. T stands for what's my trigger. R is kind of funny, but wrong thinking. What's my wrong thinking about it? U would be my unhealthy response. T would then be what is the truth of the situation, and then what is my healthy response going to be? So I'd encourage people to write those down. Maybe if they're feeling like they're an 8, to track down what was the trigger, what was the unhealthy response, and what could they change it to, and to be an investigator. So instead of just journaling.
That's good. Stephanie, if they were going to journal, what else, like what are the things that they would journal about? How can I use journaling or task tracking, whichever word makes you feel better about it? What other things can we track?
Sometimes women prefer a little more loosey-goosey, right? Like a full experiential of an event, because it helps them see things differently, name things they wouldn't necessarily have named. So sometimes I say, think about the Kodak moment, like think about the experience specifically you want to write about. Don't worry about writing in order of your day, or you don't have to track everything necessarily in order when you're journaling. That journaling is really about you and unpacking the event or experience that you want to unpack. And I always tell people, get a crappy, notebook with wire rims, something cheap from the dollar store. You can get a nice journal, and those can be really helpful for travel or keeping things in you want to keep. But our internal editor can take over when we've got a nice journal. If we want to write up the side, if we want to write in colored markers, if we want to rip it out, you're much more likely to give yourself leeway to do those things, misspell words, cuss, whatever you need to get it out initially, and then we can process it in therapy. And if you want to, light it on fire later in your backyard, it's fine. You won't feel as bad about destroying a notebook as you will a really nice journal.
Yeah, it's good. It kind of reminds me of like the raw nature. Sometimes we don't get as much into just like the raw nature of following Jesus and being really honest and authentic and raw with God. I've at times been like like when I read Psalms and how David just like laid it all out, and he just like at times is like, oh my gosh, he's going after God right now. I don't know that I could ever pray like that. And I tell other people to pray like that, but then I'm like, I don't know that I could. I don't know.
Right.
It's like almost like I'm fooling God in a sense, but I love that you take it there. I mean, man, if you need to cuss, if you need to let it out, if you need to just rip that thing up, do it. But get it out. And that's another thing that I've heard in talking about anxiety is get that out of your head, and express it, because it, um, even thoughts that when we were to say them out loud seem crazy
Mhm.
in our heads, when it's just us inside our own heads, it makes so much sense.
Right. And sometimes really, really being honest with God in your journal can be very, very helpful. We're not throwing him any surprise parties. He knows how we feel better than we know how we feel.
Mm-hmm.
And
Yeah.
so let's be completely honest with him. And sometimes bringing that to therapy and processing it out loud, it takes away a lot of the shame. Because we can let you know that, hey, that's very human of you to feel that way.
Mm-hmm.
Let us support you in expressing that. And then how do we want to deal with it from here?
Yeah.
And I think that rawness also it validates the importance of just sharing the ugly, the unhealthy side too, to admit that there is a part of me. I don't want to admit that, but how can I ever confront it and work through it if I don't admit it? Right. So it's
Mm-hmm.
important to write that part down too.
Yeah, we can't
Yeah.
fix what we don't acknowledge.
Yeah. And there's something like sick and twisted in the like the hiding of it, that like when you finally get to the point of desperation or whatever it is, where you admit that to God or admit that to somebody else, and the response is, hey, me too, or yeah, that's normal, that's natural, that's human. There's something so healing in that. And that's where I think especially being able to talk to you guys could be so healing for people, to be able to just get that, just get it out, and then to have that grace filled response that you guys are talking about. So I'm noticing like some of the things that we've been talking about are, like, hey, when you get in that moment, when you feel the panic setting in, you feel that anxiety setting in, here's what you do. Are there proactive things that you tell people, like, hey, before you ever have the panic attack, before you ever feel that onset of anxiety, here's some things that you can do to proactively fight against that, or cultivate health, or I mean, cultivate gratitude? How do you advise people in that area?
I mean, one thing I would say is to anybody that's struggling with panic attacks, obviously getting an evaluation to see if there's a medication interventions that could be helpful is a good thing. Some people need that and prefer to go that route. I think it's such a personal decision, though. Also, just doing a cardio for 20 minutes, 3 to 4 times a week can help siphon some of that off. Obviously, looking at who are you surrounding yourself with? Do you have a lot of people that are draining you for various reasons, maybe because of work or situations, or do you have some toxic people in your life that you need to set some boundaries with? I do a ton of boundaries work with people around how to have loving but firm responses in situations where they feel like they're drowning because of other people. And so, we would look at that too, relationally. What's your support system like? And do you have what you need in place to manage the anxiety that you're feeling?
I think Stephanie nailed it, but I would add one of the things I feel like we're getting done with counseling when we talk about relapse prevention. If you made this progress, how do you know you're not going to backslide into it? And you're saying
Yes.
all those things Stephanie said, but even being self-aware enough, if I am, what am I going to do about it? To remind myself to go back to the gym, or to go back to journaling, to do my breathing exercises, to have that honest conversation with God and someone else to be healing. Yeah.
Yeah. Because that's part of this whole journey of life, is like, you're not going to be there forever. Everything is a season. So in the positive and the negative, if you find yourself in a really deep, dark season, it's not going to be like that forever. But also, if you find yourself getting back to health, that doesn't necessarily mean you're going to naturally stay there forever. So how do you recognize when you're slipping? It's
Right.
good. Oh, I have a great question. Tell me a little bit about, the inputs people have, because I think sometimes, Stephanie, you were talking about boundaries with people, but also I think we've got to, in this day and age when we're sometimes isolated, there's so many, through our phones, through our TVs, through Netflix, whatever, there's so many inputs that can be like in our lives. What can you tell me about like the inputs that people are bringing in mentally? How do they recognize when those things are, man, this is becoming too negative, I need to turn off
Right.
Netflix or the news or social media or whatever it is? And yeah, what
I think
advice can you
that's
give
really
there?
important. One of the things that Aaron said a while back, I don't remember the sermon series, but he said everything is a sermon. And I
Mm,
thought that's so true. Like, what are we filling our heads with? What's influencing the things? We have programs going off in the back of our brain all the time while we're doing other stuff. What's processing back there? What are we taking in? Is it junk food?
mm,
Or is it quality material? So we need to look at, if we're struggling with anxiety too, I think you make a valid point. What are we taking in? Are we looking at everybody's vacation photos on social media? I mean, are we looking at the news and are we watching things that fill us with anxiety? We want to be informed, but we also need to think about just the community around us. How can we can't control everything, but what can we influence? Where can we lend support? Where do we have a sense of purpose and meaning right now in the community we're in? Those things can help broaden our perspective and shake us loose of some of that anxiety. We feel some sense of purpose and connection with other people.
and I think to kind of piggyback on the input, something I've noticed in myself is like sometimes just that information overload. Like it may not even be bad. Like sometimes I'll just be listening to podcasts or like listening to the Bible and I'm just like I can just feel my brain go, okay, I gotta stop. Like I gotta have some time to pause and decompress and breathe a little bit. And so I think, I don't know, that to me that stands out too as we talk about inputs. I think we underestimate the value at times of just silence or like letting ourselves have space to breathe and God forbid be bored a little bit.
Yeah, be still and know I am God. Like that scripture just speaks to me a lot as somebody who's a 6 on the Enneagram. And so my brain's always on. Sometimes I need to be
Mm,
still.
yeah.
Well, like I said before, head to tpcc.org/care or /counseling to see resources that would be helpful and also to see a list of vetted counselors who we trust to give you more ongoing support to walk through issues as complex as this. Don't be ashamed about getting help. We all need it and you can't do life alone. So again, head to tpcc.org/care or /counseling to get more help and walk with Jesus through this season.